how can we analyze encounters for institutional racism? Thank you for joining me. My name is Dr. Warren Chalklen, and in this video we'll be unpacking a simple medical encounter through the lens of anti-racism and thinking through how institutional racism is operating. What is institutional racism? Well, to understand institutional racism, we have to reflect on how internalized bias affects our interpersonal relationships. Those interpersonal relationships are often governed by institutional rules, and those institutional rules can coalesce to form a structure. So, structural racism is when racism in institutions coalesces to form a structure. But those institutions are made up of people who are interacting. And so interpersonal racism is a direct result of internalized ways of superiority of one group over the other, which is a false idea. The idea of any group being superior to another is completely false. But racism is a system that advantages white skin over black skin, for example. So when we think about institutional racism, we have to understand that institutions are complex systems that produce outcomes. So Stokely Carmichael is famous for saying that when a Klan member kills a black man, that is an act of interpersonal racism. But when in that same city, 500 black babies die as a result of a lack of nutrition, systemic issues in healthcare, that is an act of institutional racism. It's the ways in which racism in these different institutions impacts people's lives. So when we think about institutional racism, it's often difficult to identify. However, there are some tools we can use to reflect, unmask, and dismantle this. The LIPS, Language, Institutions, Policies, and Symbols, is a very powerful tool. When we think about language, we have to think about the words that are used to describe power distribution. When people talk about a police force versus a police service, a police force enforces violence. A police service serves people, serves communities. So the language is very, very critical because it shapes the purpose of the institution. When we think about what an institution actually is, it's a way of organizing or disorganizing social patterns of behavior. So, for example, a hospital is a space in which we can access medical care. It's an institution in which we can go to for care, okay? Instead of staying at home and perhaps getting care from just our family, for example. The policies are any course of action or procedure by an individual or group with the power that determines actions, decisions, and priorities that affect others. A lack of policy is also a policy. Very, very important. Symbols are anything that carry meaning to a specific society or culture, and these often represent the perspectives of those in power. One of the most important symbols to dismantle and unpack is the Founding Fathers' Mount Rushmore narrative. The idea that people founded this country who have white skin is completely false. This country, the United States, has been inhabited for thousands of years by indigenous peoples. Okay, and so the idea that white people came here to found this country is completely racist. All right, and so we have to understand how those symbols are operating in order to dismantle them and to question them and critique them, and to reframe them in their truth, in their reality. So let's think about a situation. So on the right-hand side, we have a case study where a pregnant black woman overhears a nurse referring to her as a Medicaid mother. When the expected mom confronts the nurse, she is told that she should be grateful that she was admitted to this hospital because they made an exception for her. Let's reflect on the language in this situation. Firstly, what does this person mean by a Medicaid baby? Or Medicaid mother, excuse me. We have to go deeper under the language. The fact that the nurse says that she should be grateful. What's living underneath the surface of that? And that's really where we need to go. We need to understand the roots of those words. What is the meaning? What is the power in this situation? The second thing we have to think about is the fact that this nurse is given authority as a nurse because she is part of a hospital, which is an institution. Institutions give individuals who would otherwise not have authority, they give people authority. Police officers, when they take off the uniform, have less authority than when they have the uniform on. That uniform represents the institution that they have. And so when this person is talking about a Medicaid mother, she is enacting the culture of the institution. And so we have to understand that the language people use is a litmus test for the culture of the institution. The policies, how are existing or non-existing policies shaping the situation? Well, when someone says a Medicaid mother, we have to think of the fact that Medicaid is a policy in and of itself. Okay, so what does that mean? What is the underlying understanding of this? Okay. Secondly, we have to think about the fact that this nurse is talking to somebody that understands what she is saying. And so when there's agreement between two institutional actors, we have an informal rule, an informal policy that is at play in the situation. And that's very important to understand. When folks have a clear understanding of language, that is really where informal policies begin to coalesce. And so if we analyze and critique that language and how the institutional culture is playing out, we begin to see how institutional racism begins to form. Okay. And finally, the symbols, the idea that in this encounter, the nurse had the audacity not to apologize, but to actually reinforce this sense of power, reinforces the institutional racism that's at play here. She's saying to this person, and the class issue as well, the nurse is saying to this mother that she should be grateful that she is receiving a human right. She is degrading her humanity through this process. And so the language, the institutions, the policies, and the symbols are coalescing to create a culture of racism. Now, this institution is not unique. This same patient may be called other words outside of the hospital setting that not necessarily have the exact same meaning, but the connotations and associations are exactly the same. And so the structure of racism has a language that is made up of all these different small, in some cases subtle nuances of racism, such as referring to a black woman as a Medicaid mother. Okay, that is an indication there that, and the fact that this mother is not called a patient or not called a mother, just a mother, an expected mother, says to us that there is the presence of racism, and an anti-racist lens uses language, institutions, policies, and symbols to unpack, unmask, and ultimately work to dismantle the presence of racism.